I always knew the neighborhood was under the thumb of an intolerable Homeowners Association, HOA, but I never imagined they could reach new heights of absurdity. The HOA was an insufferable force, an ever-present reminder of bureaucracy gone wild. Their leader, the woman at the center of this chaos, acted as if she had been anointed the supreme sheriff of the entire neighborhood from birth. She wielded her authority with a self-righteous arrogance, as if every resident was subject to her whims and her whims alone. This woman was notorious for her petty obsessions. She spent her days enforcing bizarre and trivial rules, making life unbearable for anyone who dared to defy her. From issuing fines for something as insignificant as the shade of curtains hanging from windows, to organizing pointless meetings to discuss irrelevant issues. She was always ready to exert her so-called power. It was infuriating, but I never imagined that her obsessive need for control would escalate to the point where it could actually endanger the life of my child. The rules, she argued, were absolute. The HOA's regulations were her Bible, and woe to anyone who dared to challenge them. She didn't care about reason or compassion. She cared about keeping her grip on power, no matter the cost. Her obsession with enforcing every single rule, no matter how ridiculous, was her mission in life. The kind of person who would see even the most trivial things as insurmountable obstacles in their pursuit of control. I could never have predicted just how far she would go to maintain that power. In that moment, I truly understood the depths of her absurdity. She was more than a mere nuisance. She was a danger, a real threat to the lives of the people she was meant to serve. Her rigid adherence to rules, the ones that she had invented, was about to cost me everything. It was an afternoon like any other, or it should have been, but my daughter was about to experience something that no child should ever have to face, all because of this woman and her unyielding obsession with control. It started as an ordinary afternoon. At least that's what I thought. My daughter was in the living room playing with her toys, laughing and enjoying the simple joy of her childhood. Nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary. I was just finishing up a few things when I heard her voice, faint and strained, calling my name. My heart skipped a beat. I rushed into the living room, expecting to find her tangled up in her toys or just needing some attention. But when I saw her face, my stomach dropped. Her skin had gone pale, almost ashen, and her lips were beginning to turn a sickly purple. It was the kind of sight that sends a cold wave of panic through any parent. Her breathing was labored, shallow, and wheezing with each gasping breath. I knew something was wrong, really wrong. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just a bad cold or something minor. But deep down, I felt the panic creeping in. She was struggling to breathe. My daughter, the one person in my life I'd protect at any cost, was now in danger. I couldn't waste a second. My mind raced as I dialed 911, desperately trying to keep my voice steady for the sake of my daughter, while internally my thoughts screamed at me to do something, anything. The dispatcher reassured me that help was on the way, but it didn't ease the knot tightening in my chest. I could hear the ambulance in the distance, and I just prayed they'd get here in time. Every second felt like an eternity. I could see her struggling, fighting for air, and my heart was in pieces. Every breath she took felt like a battle. The paramedics were on their way, but who knew the real obstacle wouldn't be traffic, time, or luck? No, it was about to be something far worse. A woman whose thirst for control had no bounds. At that moment, I felt helpless. Time was running out, and my daughter's life was in the balance. But the real fight had just begun, and it wasn't going to be with time or illness. It was with someone who was about to prove that rules, in her eyes, came before anything, even life itself. The ambulance arrived within minutes, and for a brief moment I felt a sense of relief. The sound of the sirens had never been more comforting. Help was here. They were going to save my daughter. But that relief was short-lived, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread as soon as I realized the first obstacle wasn't traffic or a delay. It was the woman who had the power to stop them from doing their job. The entrance to my house was located in the common area of the neighborhood, which, unfortunately, was under the strict control of the HOA. I could see it now. The one person who had the power to either save my daughter's life or condemn her to further suffering, standing in the middle of the street like an immovable statue. There she was, the HOA president, arms crossed, glaring at the paramedics as if they were nothing more than kids, trying to sneak into a club without an invitation. It was absurd. My daughter's life hung in the balance, and this woman was standing there, looking like she was about to lecture the paramedics on what they were allowed to do. The driver of the ambulance, looking bewildered and clearly frustrated, rolled down his window, hoping to reason with her. One of the paramedics, his voice tight with urgency, explained that this was a medical emergency and they needed to get in immediately. But this woman, the self-appointed gatekeeper of the neighborhood, wouldn't budge. She raised her hand as if she were directing traffic at a non-existent intersection and simply stated that the ambulance wasn't allowed to enter. Not because there was no emergency, but because it didn't have prior authorization. Rules are rules, she said, as if she were discussing the price of groceries and not the life of my child. She refused to let the paramedics pass, insisting that emergency vehicles needed to be approved first by the HOA, as though you could schedule a medical emergency like a dentist appointment. I stood there frozen in horror, watching my daughter's chest rise and fall in ragged breaths, her face growing more lifeless by the second. Desperation surged through me. I ran to the gate, shouting that my daughter was dying, that we needed help right now, but she just stared at me unmoved. My heart felt like it was about to stop as I realized that this woman, this monster of bureaucracy, was standing between my daughter and her only chance at survival. The paramedics, their faces etched with frustration, tried to reason with her, but she remained unmoved. Every second that passed felt like a lifetime. My daughter's breaths were growing weaker, and I was losing my grip on control. The situation was deteriorating fast. The paramedic's voice, now strained with urgency, pleaded with her once again, his tone full of panic. "Ma'am, this is a medical emergency. We need to get in immediately." But to my shock, this woman, this embodiment of senseless bureaucracy, didn't flinch. Instead, she stood there, as if she were enforcing the most trivial of rules, not the fate of a child. "Rules are rules," she repeated coldly, as if those words held any weight in this life or death situation. She pointed to some email she had received, a piece of paper, as if that email could justify keeping an ambulance from entering when a child's life was at risk. She was fixated on a document, an approval process, instead of the dying child right in front of her. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my voice trembling with both fury and fear. "My daughter is suffocating," I shouted, desperation flooding my every word, but she didn't budge. She just kept talking about the proper procedure, about how no unregistered vehicles were allowed to enter the neighborhood without prior authorization. How could anyone be so blind to the urgency of the situation? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was this really happening? Was this woman seriously standing there, refusing to let the ambulance pass, all because of her precious rules? I wanted to charge across that street, to grab her by the shoulders and shake some sense into her. But I knew I couldn't. I had to keep my focus on my daughter. But how could I? How could I just stand there and watch as this lunatic played God with my child's life? Her reasoning, her obsession with the rules, was infuriating. Every word she spoke felt like a slap in the face. She was playing a game of power, and my daughter was paying the price. My anger and fear collided, leaving me breathless. Every second, every moment that passed was a second my daughter might not have. And yet this woman wouldn't let them in. At that moment, the paramedics had clearly had enough. I could see the exhaustion in their eyes, the hopelessness creeping in as they looked at the woman, who was still blocking their path. The ambulance driver, visibly frustrated and near his breaking point, slammed his hand on the steering wheel before making a decision that would change everything. Without waiting for another word from her, he put the vehicle into gear. Ignoring the absurd demands of the HOA, president, and the worthless piece of paper, she clung to like it was a lifeline. The sirens screamed louder as the ambulance shot forward, pushing past the woman standing in the street. For a moment, I thought she would leap in front of the vehicle, determined to stop it. But the paramedics had made their choice. They weren't going to wait for a mad woman's permission. The woman did exactly what I feared. She threw herself in front of the ambulance, blocking its path, screaming at the top of her lungs as though her life depended on it. "You can't do this. This is a crime," she screamed, her voice shrill with a mixture of rage and fear. It was as if she saw herself as the tragic hero in some bizarre story, protecting the sacred rules of the neighborhood no matter the cost. Her arms flailed, desperate to stop the paramedics, but they were done playing her game. The driver slammed on the horn, urging her to move, but she didn't budge. The security guards, who had been nothing more than passive spectators up until now, finally attempted to intervene. They tried to pull her away, but she fought back with all her might, screaming that they were breaking the law. "This is a crime. You can't just drive through here like that," she yelled, holding her phone up to film the scene, likely hoping to document the outrage she thought she was preventing. Meanwhile, inside my house, my daughter's condition was worsening. Each breath she took was more desperate than the last. The seconds felt like hours, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing her. The paramedics were finally able to break free from the woman's grip on the situation, and they rushed inside, ready to help my daughter. But even then, the chaos outside didn't stop. The woman was still shouting, still filming, still trying to make it all about her. I guided the paramedics to my daughter's side, praying it wasn't too late. Every second felt like it could be her last. But the real fight was still going on. Outside the house, in the world of madness and rules that this woman had created. The moment my daughter was stabilized and the paramedics began to get her ready for transport, a small sliver of relief finally washed over me. She was breathing easier now, her color slowly returning to normal, but the fear still clung to me like a shadow. I knew it could have been much worse. If we had lost any more time, if that woman had had her way, I didn't want to think about what could have happened. But there was no time to dwell on that now. The adrenaline coursing through my veins kept me focused on what needed to happen next. I quickly found my phone and dialed the police, trying to keep my voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. The dispatcher listened attentively as I explained what had happened. I didn't hold back. I gave them every detail: how the HOA president had obstructed a medical emergency, how she had put my daughter's life at risk for the sake of some ridiculous rule. The gravity of what had occurred was clear, and I wasn't going to let it slide. "Sir, this is serious," the dispatcher finally said after a brief silence. "We're sending a team right now to investigate the situation." For the first time since this nightmare had started, I allowed myself to feel a flicker of hope. This wasn't going to go unnoticed. Someone was finally going to hold this woman accountable. I hung up the phone and rushed to the ambulance, trying to make sure my daughter was comfortable for the journey to the hospital. As we left the house, the last thing I saw was that woman, still standing in the street, fuming with rage. Her arms were crossed, her face twisted in anger as she watched us drive away. Her phone was still in her hand, and I knew she was already planning her next move. But it didn't matter anymore. She had lost. On the way to the hospital, my thoughts were consumed with a single question: what would happen next? Would the police actually follow through? Would she be held accountable for her reckless actions? The journey seemed endless, each minute crawling by with excruciating slowness. But when we finally arrived at the hospital, I knew we weren't finished yet. This was just the beginning. As the paramedics wheeled my daughter into the emergency room, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. I wasn't going to let this woman get away with what she'd done. My daughter was alive, but it was only because we had fought tooth and nail to make it happen. And now I was going to make sure that woman faced the consequences for putting her life at risk. The next day, I felt the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on me. I was still shaking from the events, but now it was time to make sure the woman, who had put my daughter's life at risk, would face the consequences. As I sat there, the anger inside me began to boil again. Not just at her, but at the entire HOA for allowing this to happen. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was my lawyer. "Are you sitting down?" he asked, his voice strained with disbelief. I told him I was, and he immediately launched into what he'd discovered. The HOA president had already begun trying to cover her tracks. She had called a meeting, attempting to make it all seem like she had done nothing wrong, that she was just following the rules, and that everything was misunderstood. I could feel my blood boiling as I listened. They thought they could sweep this under the rug. They thought they could ignore what had happened. I wasn't going to let that happen. My daughter's life had been on the line, and these people, this so-called community, were trying to paint the woman who nearly killed her as the victim. I wasn't about to let that stand. I'm filing a complaint, my lawyer continued. Not just for the obstruction of the ambulance, but for the fine they tried to impose on you. This is retaliation and it's illegal. We're going to take it further. It felt like a light at the end of a very dark tunnel. The idea that this woman and the HOA would be forced to answer for their actions sent a rush of determination through me. The injustice, the arrogance of it all. Everything had to be exposed. There was no backing down. The next day, I received an email from the HOA. They claimed that the situation had been handled improperly, but of course they tried to pass the blame onto me. They even had the audacity to threaten a fine. A $5,000 fine, they said, for allowing an unauthorized vehicle to enter the property. It was absurd. They were trying to punish me for the ambulance that saved my daughter's life. I read the email 3 times, my hands trembling with fury. I wasn't going to just sit back and take it. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer again. This time I was ready to take them to court. I would make them pay for what they had done. The fight wasn't over and I was more determined than ever to win. The aftermath of the incident was swift and brutal. The HOA president's downfall was immediate, and yet, I could feel the storm just beginning to pick up. The story of her obstruction of the ambulance spread quickly among the neighbors, and the reaction was explosive. Some residents were outraged, siding with me, while others, still loyal to the HOA, muttered about how the rules were there for a reason. I could feel the tension in the air. It was thick, palpable, and the community was divided like never before. I had no intention of backing down, and neither did my lawyer. The media had already caught wind of the story, and the headline that ran in one of the city's largest newspapers was enough to make anyone in the HOA panic. HOA blocks ambulance. Nearly kills child. The story exposed everything. The woman's actions. The absurd fine they tried to impose on me. And the fact that a child's life had been at risk because of her obsession with rules. The article was a bombshell, and it reverberated through the community like a shockwave. The HOA, which had once held all the power, was now facing a storm it couldn't control. Rumors began circulating that some residents were even considering moving out, fearing that the neighborhood's reputation would be permanently tarnished. Property values were at risk, and no one wanted to live in a community where the HOA president had literally tried to block an ambulance from entering. The reputation of the HOA board members was crumbling before their eyes, and they knew it. A few days later, I received another email from the HOA, this time with a formal apology. The president, they claimed, had decided to step down, and they were going to review the regulations regarding medical emergencies to ensure nothing like this happened again. It was clear to me that they were trying to save face, trying to contain the damage. The woman who had once wielded her power with such arrogance, thinking she was untouchable, was now nothing more than a local joke. But I wasn't finished yet. The lawsuit against the HOA was still in full swing, and my lawyer wasn't letting up. They tried to offer a settlement, but I knew better. I would only accept if they rescinded the fine and paid damages for what they had put us through. And when it was all said and done, I would make sure that this would never happen again to anyone else. The HOA was going to pay. This was just the beginning. The dust finally settled, and it became clear that the HOA had lost. I had won, not just for my daughter, but for every resident who had ever felt the oppressive weight of that association's rules. But the victory didn't feel sweet just yet. I still couldn't shake the image of that woman, standing there in the street, her face twisted in fury as she watched us leave for the hospital. I knew she would never let this go without a fight, and as the days passed, her reaction confirmed that she was far from finished. It wasn't just the settlement that made her feel defeated, it was the way the neighborhood turned on her. The residents who had once tiptoed around her, afraid of her power, now saw her for what she truly was, a bully hiding behind a facade of rules. It didn't take long before the silent vendettas began. Copies of the article detailing her reckless actions started, mysteriously appearing on her doorstep. Anonymous letters filled with phrases like, "The HOA above human life," were dropped in her mailbox, a constant reminder of the disaster she had caused. As much as she tried to act like nothing had happened, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted. People avoided her at all costs, refusing to even acknowledge her existence at community events. The neighbors who had once fawned over her, pretending to respect her power, now looked the other way when she passed by. And then it came, the moment she knew the game was over. She put her house up for sale. No one knew where she was going, and frankly, no one cared. The HOA, still reeling from the damage, tried to recover. They tried to maintain their power, but they were a shadow of what they had been. The members who had once supported the president were now scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. I'd already made sure they knew this wasn't over. The settlement was in place, but I wasn't done yet. The media had had their say, the community had spoken, and the HOA's reputation had crumbled. The old board members and their empty rules had been exposed. This time, no one would forget what had happened. It was over for them. The nightmare of the HOA was finished. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe easy knowing that my daughter was safe, and that no one could ever let something like that happen again. The HOA had fallen, and I had stood tall. It felt good. It felt like justice.